So we are finishing up the English Civil War, and we talked about Oliver Cromwell yesterday. And so I want to hit some of the highlights of things we're going to be talking about in Wednesday's class to make sure that you guys are caught up to speed. Do make sure that you read through the end of the chapter where we cover all these things, because it will probably put together a few things that I may not be able to hit on in just these few minutes that I have. But I want to make sure that I was able to fill in some things that you may miss out on by not being in class. So take some notes and make sure you pay attention to some of the things that we talk about in addition to reading the end of the chapter. So as we talked about Oliver Cromwell yesterday, we said that he was going to be on the side of the Roundheads right over here, and he was going to go against the king, and they were going to fight in the Civil War. We said that the turning point of the war was the Battle of Naseby, where the Roundheads defeated the Cavaliers and, in particular, King Charles I. Now, that didn't automatically mean that they had control of the country. We watched the video on the beheading of Charles I yesterday, but there are a lot of other details that we are leaving out. And it's important for you to understand that it's not just one thing happens and the next thing, that there's a lot of other uncertainty, a lot of upheaval. They actually sign a little bit of a peace treaty between the two sides, and then peace breaks down. They actually go back to a civil war. They have a Civil War Part 2, if you want to call it that, sometime after they behead Charles I. And so the country is in total upheaval. But as we look at Oliver Cromwell and his rise to power, we said that he was going to establish the Protectorate. And the Protectorate was a form of government in which Oliver Cromwell served as the head of the government. He was not king, nor did they try to crown him as king, but he was, for lack of a better term, just the best leader, and he was in charge until somebody else removed him from power. And he never really tried to rule as king. He was not ruthless. He was not an absolutist or anything like that, but he was definitely the guy in charge, and that rubbed people the wrong way as well, because he almost looked like he was trying to take over power himself, when in actuality that was not his intent. So he established a protectorate. He called himself the Lord Protector, and that was his way of saying, I'm trying to protect our homeland, I'm trying to protect our government. And he wanted to establish a rule of the people, and that was difficult to do because so many people had a different way of doing things or different idea on how things should be done. Well, after Oliver Cromwell is off the scene, no longer around, the people begin to wish that they had not been so hasty in their decision before, and they want a king back. Well, they go back and they look at the line of Charles I, and they know that he has a son, and his son has been hiding out in France for all these years while this civil war has been going on. And so they send a letter to France and they say, hey, Charles II, we'd like you to come back and be our king. And I don't know about you, but I'd be a little hesitant, a little skeptical that the people who beheaded my father are asking me to come back and be their king. Not sure I'd be real excited to do that. But he does. He comes back, and this period of time is called the Restoration, which they are going to restore the throne of England to the Tudor family. And so as Charles II comes back, he comes back with Parliament leading the charge, and they say, Charles, if you're going to come back and be our king, you're going to have to do some things first. First of all, understand that Parliament is in charge. You are just our leader. And so with that, he agrees to sign the Habeas Corpus Act. So the Habeas Corpus Act, in a nutshell, means that the king cannot arrest anybody without some sort of reason, and you can't hold somebody in jail without them having a violation of the law. So you can't just throw them in jail just for the fun of it. This apparently had been a major problem with his father and with other kings in the past that had just thrown people in jail for no apparent reason. So in order to protect the people from this type of abuse of authority, they signed the Habeas Corpus Act into law. Consequently, they thought this was good enough to put in the United States Constitution as well, and it has become one of our laws under the exact same name. So what he does as king is he tries to restore his family's rule to England, but with an immense amount of power being taken away from him. He has nowhere near the same power that his father or others had had before him. Now Parliament is really calling a lot of the shots. When we move on to talk about James II, He is the brother of Charles. Charles did not have any children that were eligible for the throne, and so James II, the brother of Charles, now becomes king. James did not have any aspirations of having a family, nor did anybody expect him to. However, I should pull up the picture. There's James right there. James has a son at the age of 56, and most people thought he had been beyond the years of having children, but not the case. Well, James was very, very Catholic, and this brought a fear of a restoration of Catholicism to England, and this caused people to question whether this was the right family to be leading them. And so it brings this fear of absolutism because of James now having a son who's in line for the throne, who will no doubt be Catholic, that the people began to question whether he was really a good fit. So a few members of parliament travel to the Netherlands, and they find out that the next in line for the throne would have been William of Orange. And so they go to William and they say, "We'd like for you to be our king." And they bring him down. And they also make a similar deal as what they did with Charles II. They say, "If you're going to be our king, we want you to make some concessions to us." So this happens around 1688. We call it the Glorious Revolution because it's a bloodless revolution. There's no fighting, there's nobody who dies. Basically, James II says, "Okay, fine, I agree to leave. I will give up my throne as long as you don't kill me." And so that opens the door for William of Orange and Mary to come in and rule England together. So the two of them become the monarchs of England on the condition that they are willing to sign the Bill of Rights, and which they do. Now, the Bill of Rights gives the people their individual freedoms and rights as citizens. And it was so important to the British people that they made sure that this was part of the deal before inviting them to become king and queen. And consequently, they thought it was that important to put it in the United States Constitution and follow the English Bill of Rights with the American Bill of Rights they put in our Constitution. A lot of similar laws in those two, but we'll talk more about those when we get to American history. One other important note to take here is regarding the Act of Settlement. Now, this happens a few years later into William and Mary's rule, but very notable during their reign because the Act of Settlement limits the king's power. And in addition to limiting their power, it establishes the constitutional monarchy. That is the same type of government that England still has today. And so as a result of William and Mary's agreeing to follow what Parliament wanted them to do and signing the Act of Settlement, it now established the long-term reign for the constitutional monarchy in England. So that sums up what's going on in England in their Civil War and brings us now to a balance of power that happens in Europe during this time. There's a number of alliances that are beginning to form that begin to scare people because of the great amount of power that they are trying to accomplish. So we begin here. The first of the three is the War of Spanish Succession. So what happens is Louis XIV has a grandson who is in line for the throne of Spain. Spain's king dies, and he has no direct heir. The closest heir happens to be Louis XIV's grandson. And that meant that if that were to happen, he were to take the throne of Spain, and Louis XIV were to die, then that meant that it was feasible that Spain and France could merge and become one superpower, and no other country in Europe would stand a chance against them. So that's where these other smaller countries, and I'll take a look here, I'll show you this map, and this is what we would have seen as a map of Europe at that time. So you can see here, here's France under Louis XIV's rule. Here's Spain, and Spain also controls some of the land down here at the base of Italy. Had they controlled all of this land, it would have meant really bad things for the rest of Europe. So the other European countries, they end up forming the Grand Alliance. It became everybody else against Louis XIV. And Louis XIV, in his attempt here to take the Spanish throne through his grandson, formed a lot of enemies. And his grandson was just kind of caught in the middle. So this alliance here was formed to stop Louis XIV. And they end up working together against Louis and forcing him to spend a lot of money that Louis XIV really didn't have. And of course, we talked about all the money with the Palace of Versailles, but it comes down to Louis XIV is forced to give up. And they signed the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. So the treaty here ends the fighting, and it gives Britain some control of parts of the Netherlands in the New World. We talked about how New Amsterdam, which had been controlled by Henry Hudson in the Netherlands, was going to change possession to England. And that's exactly what happens right here in the Treaty of Utrecht. It now becomes New York instead of the New Netherlands. And we also see that England merges with Scotland to become Great Britain. And this is the first time in history that they are really referred to as Great Britain. Prior to this, technically, it should be called England, and after this, technically, it should be called Great Britain, but we often use those interchangeably anyway. So our second major event is the War of Austrian Succession. So this is all put together because of the Pragmatic Sanction. This was a document that was signed by all of Austria's neighbors, promising to respect the boundaries while Maria Theresa was on the throne. They would not invade her space, and pretty soon Frederick of Prussia violated this agreement. And he begins to invade her territory. So does France, and so does Spain. Now England comes in to defend Austria. So you've got France, Spain, and Prussia against England and Austria in this particular conflict that happens here. A lot of fighting goes on in the middle of Europe. We fast forward through all these events that are going on, get to the main elements of it, and we see the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. So this was a ceasefire. It ended the fighting, but there was no real peace. Nobody was able to gain an upper hand, and they agreed to stop fighting, but there was more to come. And perhaps that is best evidenced through the 7 Years' War. Now, the 7 Years' War is probably better known to us as the French and Indian War, and so feel free to interchange those names. But if you were to be totally accurate, 7 Years' War is the war in Europe, and the French and Indian War is the war in North America. You should know that they do go together, and they both mean the same war. So the 7 Years' War initially breaks out in Europe, and it's going to spill over into the New World. We'll break that down a little bit more when we get to U.S. history. But for right now, it's important that you know that France was fighting against Great Britain in the New World. And so as we zoom in on our map here, we can see how France is this kind of lightly shaded purple, and Great Britain is the dark green. They're fighting each other there. And that is the French and Indian part. Indians sided with the French against the British. Now we also have Prussia, who's attacking Austria. So Prussia and Austria attack one another. Prussia thought that France would be too busy and too preoccupied with things going on in North America to care about what's going on over here in Europe. Well, that was not the case, because France now joins with Austria in order to stop Prussia, which effectively means that France is fighting two wars. They're fighting one over in North America, and they're fighting one in Europe. Bad news for the French, really good news if you are pulling for Great Britain. And that's where William Pitt, he was the prime minister to Great Britain. He ends up giving assistance to Prussia in order to preoccupy the French over here in Europe and prolong the war to make sure that the British had a better chance of winning in the New World. So we get to the end of this war, and it is decided by the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris ends the war, and there are three major consequences that come as a result of this. First of all, France loses all of its territory east of the Mississippi River. And we zoom in on this, we can see that that was a lot of territory for them to lose, and the British now have control of a lot of this territory here. So that was a huge consequence and a huge benefit for the British over in the New World. Secondly, France loses their territories in India. And for this, we haven't talked a whole lot about this, but France had a lot of trade going on over here in India. That now changes hands, and most of that goes to the British as well. And then the third consequence is that Spain loses Florida to Britain, but in exchange, in this whole fallout here, they get Louisiana. And so we look over here in North America, they get this territory of Louisiana, and the British get Florida. So as we summarize the Treaty of Paris and who came out in the best deal, I think we clearly have to give that to Britain. They emerge as the world's most powerful of all the nations as a result of the Treaty of Paris and the 7 Years' War. France is nearly bankrupt. Spain, they're still pretty powerful, but not what they once were. And so by default, England becomes the most powerful, and they got the best deal out of this entire treaty. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Make sure that you are studying your book as well as studying the notes on Quizlet. And if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help you. All right, we'll talk to you later.